The public discourse is saturated with kinetic threats. Lockheed Martin announces it will dramatically turn up Patriot missile production, and the market cheers. This is strategic misdirection, engineered to focus attention on a symmetric 20th century threat model. While you are watching the skies for inbound missiles, the real vector of attack is being prepared in absolute silence. The primary asymmetric protocol against a state-level actor like the US is not a launch-on-warning event. It is a launch-on-silence event. According to analysts at CSIS, the systemic liability is not our borders, but the 1.3 million kilometers of subsea fiber optic cable that function as the nation's central nervous system. These cables carry over 97% of all global data and trillions in financial transactions daily. They are indefensible. Simultaneously, a low-orbit blinding protocol targets key satellite constellations. The objective is not kinetic destruction, which is noisy and easily attributable. The objective is to induce signal denial. A coordinated severing of these data arteries, both undersea and in orbit, triggers the paralysis protocol. No SWIFT transactions, no GPS, no market data, no logistics. The entire economic and military apparatus is rendered inert. This creates the blind Leviathan, a state with unparalleled kinetic power, but its eyes have been removed and its nervous system severed. It is a strategic kill switch. This is the operational reality of cognitive warfare, a concept NATO's own chief scientist warns is the next frontier. The goal is not to defeat the US military, but to force a systemic solvency crisis, turning the state's own internal economic fragility into the weapon of its own destruction. The question is not if an adversary will attack the United States, but how. The doctrine of symmetric deterrence is obsolete. When a state cannot compete kinetically or economically, it doesn't surrender. It pivots. Weakness forces a strategic reinvention towards asymmetry. Consider the operational landscape. The US leverages overwhelming symmetric force. Lockheed is ramping up Patriot missile production, a clear signal of kinetic dominance. Economically, the protocol is just as blunt. The US blockade against Venezuela was engineered to trigger a total economic collapse. These are demonstrations of brute force. The message is simple. You cannot win on our terms. This pressure creates the motive. An adversary, facing symmetric checkmate, is forced to evaluate its own systemic liabilities. CSIS analysis confirms Russia's engagement in Ukraine is not a war of choice, but a solvency crisis in motion. The kinetic cost and domestic unpopularity represent a catastrophic drain on state liquidity and political capital. When your conventional options guarantee bankruptcy, you are forced to change the game. This is the pivot point. The adversary, unable to absorb further symmetric losses and facing internal fracture, must find a new vector. NATO's own chief scientist identifies this vector as cognitive warfare. It is a launch-on-warning protocol for a state on the brink of collapse. They cannot afford another missile. They cannot withstand another sanction. Their target, therefore, cannot be a US asset. It must be a US liability. Why attack a carrier group when Federal Reserve Chairman Powell himself sounds the alarm on a domestic housing crisis? This pre-existing fragility is the perfect target. The goal is not to defeat the US military, but to trigger a cascade failure in its economy, a solvency crisis designed to neutralize the state from within. This is not about winning a war. It is about making war unwinnable for the United States by bankrupting it. The entire model of American power projection is based on a kinetic cost curve that is now inverted. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, lays out the mathematical certainty. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This isn't a battle, it's an arbitrage. This radical cost inversion creates what strategists term the democratization of violence. While defense contractors like Lockheed ramp up production of multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles, adversaries can field thousands of lethal, autonomous assets for the cost of a single interceptor. State-level military dominance becomes irrelevant when non-state actors, or near-peer competitors, can achieve strategic effects with consumer-grade technology. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal force has collapsed. The core vector of this asymmetric strategy, however, is not kinetic. It is cognitive. The objective is to force a systemic over-expenditure on defense, bleeding the domestic economy. Every $1 billion allocated to countering cheap threats is $1 billion not allocated to servicing debt or addressing critical internal liabilities. Like the housing crisis, Federal Reserve officials are now sounding alarms on. The adversary's goal is to force a choice: launch on warning defense spending or domestic solvency. You cannot have both. This blueprint is a direct reflection of U.S. doctrine. The United States uses economic blockades, as seen with Venezuela, to engineer state collapse. Adversaries have studied this playbook. They understand that the true center of gravity is not the military, but the intricate financial system that underwrites it. The drone is simply a tool to apply leverage, a cheap, kinetic trigger for an expensive, systemic, and ultimately fatal solvency crisis. It weaponizes America's own economic fragility against itself. The primary battlefield is not where the missiles are deployed. While U.S. defense planners fixate on ramping up Patriot missile production, the actual theater of operations has shifted. Adversaries have identified the gray zone, not as a geographic location, but as a systemic space where conventional deterrence is irrelevant. These gray zones function as proxy laboratories. The U.S. economic blockade of Venezuela was not seen by its rivals as a punishment, but as a field test. They observed, documented, and modeled the exact sequence of events that leads from an external economic shock to internal societal fracture. It was a live-fire demonstration of a solvency cascade. This is the core of asymmetric escalation. The objective is not to match U.S. kinetic power, but to bypass it entirely. The data gathered from these proxy labs is used to refine cognitive warfare protocols, as outlined in NATO's own strategic reports. The goal is to develop narratives that act as financial accelerants. Analysts at institutions like CSIS identify regions with similar economic structures to the U.S., such as Canada or South Africa, as potential staging grounds. These are not targets themselves, but sandboxes for testing specific economic attack vectors. A manufactured panic targeting a regional banking system or energy grid serves as a dress rehearsal. The protocols refined in these labs are designed for one purpose: to exploit pre-existing domestic liabilities. When figures like the Fed chair sound the alarm on the U.S. housing crisis, it is not just a market warning. For an adversary, it is a signal, a targeting solution. They now possess a tested blueprint to turn a systemic weakness into a systemic collapse, neutralizing the state from within. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a strategy of strength, but a protocol born from fear. It is the state's procedure to launch its nuclear arsenal the moment its early warning systems detect an incoming enemy strike. The logic is brutal. Fire your missiles before they are destroyed in their silos. It is a mathematical calculation against the clock. This protocol, however, contains a systemic liability. An adversary understands it cannot compete with the kinetic output of the U.S., evidenced by industrial ramp-ups like Lockheed's plan to increase Patriot missile production. Their vector is not symmetric. It is asymmetric. The target is not the missile, but the data that commands it. Enter the fog of digital war. A hostile cyber attack blinds the radar and satellite feeds. The screens go black. The commander now faces a zero-sum choice. Is this a system malfunction, or is it a deliberate blinding action preceding a full-scale launch? The protocol dictates a response to a verified threat, but the verification system itself has just been neutralized. To wait for confirmation is to risk the total liquidation of the nation's deterrent. To launch is to initiate a global thermonuclear exchange based on what could be a ghost signal. Analysts at CSIS confirm this forces the commander to act out of fear. This is the operationalization of cognitive warfare, a domain NATO's chief scientist has warned is the new front line. The adversary weaponizes the US's own protocols, forcing a choice between paralysis and catastrophic escalation. The current doctrine is a function of inertia. The United States escalates investment in symmetric, kinetic power. Lockheed is ordered to surge Patriot missile production. Simultaneously, it deploys symmetric economic leverage, evidenced by the U.S. blockade on Venezuelan oil, designed to induce state collapse. And this is a predictable, linear strategy. It is also a strategic trap. Adversaries unable to compete on a symmetric axis are forced into an asymmetric response. The vector is not military. As NATO's own chief scientist warns in reports on cognitive warfare, the true target is the core systemic liability of the target state. That liability has been publicly identified. Federal Reserve Chairman Powell has sounded the alarm on an accelerating U.S. housing crisis. The calibration shot will not be a blackout. That is too overt. Within the next 12 months, expect a targeted data integrity event directed at a Tier 2 mortgage servicing aggregator. It will not be a data breach or a ransomware attack. It will be a logic-based corruption of payment and escrow records for a specific region, timed to coincide with month-end processing. The event will be Attribution Impossible, officially designated a catastrophic software failure. It will inject chaos and distrust directly into the fragile housing finance system Powell identified, testing the state's ability to manage a solvency crisis over a kinetic one. It is a signal designed to measure systemic brittleness before the main leverage is applied.